Righty. So basically, this is on the whole thing. Some of you might have seen the video. It was a live sort of video I did, or it was a recording, and it was basically on Rosewrist. Rosewrist, someone who had discussed the economic calculation problem with his guest, and obviously, so just to explain, obviously from your side, so you can help the viewers understand your side, because you had actually discussed the economic calculation problem with Rosewrist, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
So it's like
Yeah.
from
I guess just explain my thoughts on the economic calculation problem. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Wonderful. Yeah. Howdy here. I'm Nikolai. I was the person that Rosewrist talked to. Generally speaking, my issues with the economic calculation problem, first off, are generally on the shaky philosophical foundations of the Austrian school, mainly with praxeology. It's built off of a priori statements, not really much of actual research done at the time of Mises writing the economic calculation in socialist commonwealth. Along with this, the economic calculation problem does not necessarily account for different types of central planning systems, and it also does not account for decentral planning systems like participatory economics, which I advocate. And along with this as well, I believe Scott has a specific interpretation of the economic calculation problem. Could you mind repeating your explanation of the economic calculation problem, just so that way I can make sure what I'm hearing.
Yeah, so the economic calculation problem, and it's important to understand from my perspective, and obviously you have touched upon decentralization, and that's one of my biggest critiques of the argument when it comes to socialism, and the reason being is because from the very definition of what it means essentially around socialism is based around centralism. So like the opposite of like the opposite of centralized agriculture, the opposite of centralized healthcare, or they might want to call it universal. It's social, it's socialized medicine, it's socialized healthcare. In other words, it's socialized education, it's socialized agriculture. It's around that of centralism. So the opposite of that is basically private ownership. In other words, decentralization. Now, that's the entire issue I have over that whole thing, on the whole thing to do with socialism. But you're asking, obviously, from my perspective, the whole thing on the economic calculation problem is a resource misallocation problem. It occurs because of the price controls. In other words, what price controls are, cause, it creates distortion of price signals, because that's what prices are. Prices are not obstacles to getting things that you want. Prices are signals. They tell the market, they convey information to the market, what consumers' needs and wants are, and you gather that information through profits and losses driven by consumer demand. So it's consumers who are determining what the price signal information is, and these price information signals convey consumers' needs and wants. And when the government distorts the information of these, profits and losses by raising or lowering prices above or below market values, setting down price ceilings or price floors, the government ends up creating price distortion, and it ends up leading to that of resource misallocation. We've seen many historical examples of that. We saw, for example, when they set down a price ceiling in the 1970s that created a shortage at the pump, especially here in Great Britain in 1974. This was all because they tried to combat inflation, so they tried to set down the price ceiling. It ended up misallocating to other parts, plus the fact it created the price shortage problem. Again, it was the same issue with regards to when they set down the price ceiling. Again, in the United States, same story. Again, even with the housing shortage crisis that you saw during the Second World War, as soon as the rent controls were imposed, people over-occupied those types of housing. It was singular persons that over-occupied them, leaving people who are starting up families with a shortage. They couldn't, find any housing because it had all been over-occupied. Again, it's misallocating it to the wrong type of people because of all these type of things. So, and it's the whole issue where if you've not got the information, in my argument, of profits and losses, you don't know how much you're producing, what resources you're using, where you're going to allocate them in the market, and this is the issue, because if you don't know what you're investing in, if you don't know, how you're going to transport, etc., then of course you're faced with the serious issue, and it's the information of prices that convey that information to the market, that tells the market, this is where you're going to allocate resources to, and this is where you shouldn't, because profits and losses is conveying that information. So when you effectively get rid of profits and losses, you're destroying that very information, and that's the entire argument around the economic calculation problem. For me, it's a misunderstanding the critics have of the economic calculation problem. It's not so much the argument of the calculation. Sure, the calculation is rather quite impossible, but the main problem is the information these price signals convey. So that's the part of the argument that's kind of misunderstood.
Yeah. So just to kind of summarize it, kind of, just so that way I could get a general image of what I'm dealing with. The basic argument is that prices are a reflection of supply and demand, a type of distribution model, and profits are a representation of that demand. So if you get rid of prices, you get rid of profits, which then lead to misallocation based off of the supply and demand model. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean the whole thing on, because like you said there with the laws of supply and demand, basically prices, the information of profits and losses is gathered from consumer demand. After all, when consumers go into stores, they pick up the goods that they want, they're buying those goods, that's the information of what profits are. Profits is the information of what consumers are spending most on. So in other words, when you go into a store and you pick up goods and you hand it over the counter, and let's just say the goods that are selling most of, that's conveying to the business, here's what we need to produce more of, therefore we know what resources to use, we know where to allocate them, and the goods that are being left there on the shelves that are not selling, then of course that's the information of the goods that are the losses. That's telling the business, here's where our losses are, therefore we're not going to produce more of this, because it would be a waste of resources, it'd cost us, and it's like I said before, if you want to maximise your profits, you have to minimise your costs, therefore using fewer resources, so it's actually in the incentive of business to produce what consumers' needs and wants are. They're not going to produce for what consumers don't want, because it's going to cost the business more, it'll cost them on their profits, and they wouldn't produce things that are not selling because it's just going to make them losses, and that's the importance of profits and losses. It incentivizes that efficiency. But that's essentially what profits and losses are. Profits and losses are the information the consumer's conveying to the market. Here's what they're wanting, and here's what they don't want. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Yeah. Okay. So based off of what I'm hearing so far, at this point, I could then ask two questions that we could probably talk about in certain sections, and maybe jump off into other topics from there. The first question is mainly how good are profits a representation of consumer demand? And two, is the supply and demand model a good one to represent how prices form under capitalism? As far as I can understand so far, and at least from my perspective, my answer for both of these is that they are not that effective. Generally speaking, profits, as far as I understand, are more reflective of the wages that are being given out to the workers, as seen by Strawfus equations. And along with this as well, supply and demand not only relies on a bunch of assumptions in order to properly work, along with this as well, this just doesn't seem to bear out within how price setting works within capitalism. There's been a bunch of evidence so far showing that market pricing, so much empirical evidence for market pricing, it's in 11 nations in the Eurozone. I just don't see how supply and demand within itself can represent prices forming under capitalism. That's just my main thing so far.
Well, the issue, one would have to point out what exactly, because you would have to then elaborate on what such evidence is. I mean, no one's basing, because I knew you had brought up the term perfect competition. I'm not entirely sure what that has to do with it, because number one, I mean, there's no such thing as, perfect competition. Perfect competition is just something that's really just a made up argument, because technology changes all the time, the market changes all the time, new competitors come in all the time. There's no such thing as this, perfect competition thing. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that this leads to monopolies, etc., etc., etc. And the other part of the problem is right now we're living under, this corporatist system. And, it's like I've touched upon before. If you were to look at the 19th century of American history and contrast the difference between that of, private businesses that were left be to that of the market, and you compare the market entrepreneurs, such as the likes of James J. Hill, or compare Cornelius Vanderbilt in his industry, where he took on no government subsidies whatsoever, and then you contrast that to the political entrepreneurs who took on the government subsidies. The difference was the private companies, in other words the market entrepreneurs who took on no government subsidies, were efficient, whereas due to the government subsidies, these private companies, the hundreds of private companies, you take for example the railroad industry, all of those that took on the government subsidies, they were all inefficient and they would eventually face bankruptcy. It was the same story within the steamship industry. Now, it wasn't because the likes of, Cornelius Vanderbilt or the likes of James J. Hill were using unfair practices, far from it. It's just because of the fact that when you subsidise, you're inevitably creating inefficiency, and a good example of that story was the one I gave, and I've pointed this out numerous times before. It was the Northern Pacific Railroad Company that was attempting to build 2 railroads across the West. However, because the government was offering a large sum of money for every 1 mile of track that they would build, then of course this company was not interested in how it would go about doing it. Because after all, for every 1 mile of track that they're built, they're guaranteed a large sum of money. So they're not really going to be concerned over efficiency. They're not really going to be concerned over what materials they're going to use, or, how short they're going to make it. In fact, if anything, because they're getting a large sum of money for every 1 mile of track, they actually were incentivized to take the longer route. And what ended up happening was the company ended up building an inefficient railroad that faced damages due to weather, I think it was, before it could even open. And of course, Congress rejected them of money in order for repairs, etc. And the company ended up going bankrupt by 1873. Now, the whole point being is the fact that what you're living under is a corporatist system, not a capitalist system. And in this corporatist system, you've got special interest favours. You've got government picking and choosing winners and losers, and government's the one that basically, subsidises these certain special interest groups. And yes, as a result of subsidies, and you could even look at the farm subsidies of what's happened in, certain African countries, etc., it's created waste. And I've pointed this out before with regards to Vicky 1999. The point being is that under this corporatist system, you've got government interference, so you can't exactly expect the market to be efficient when government's heavily involved in the market. It's strangling smaller business people half to death. The smaller business people are struggling to get by because they're having to jump through all the red tape. They've got to deal with all the red tape that government's imposed. So the heavier government regulation comes at the heavier cost. So smaller businesses can't afford to compete. Meanwhile, the giant corporations are benefiting from the heavier government regulation. After all, that's what the giant corporations lobbied government for. The giant corporations were lobbying government for more and more government regulation to stamp out the competition of smaller businesses. Where people are going wrong is they're thinking that, well, corporatism's somehow about deregulation, and it's not. That's not what the giant corporations were lobbying for. They were lobbying for more government regulation to stamp out the competition of the smaller businesses. So what you've got is oligopolies, monopolies, you've got the cartelisation, and you touched upon the European Union. I mean, it's rife with all of that sort of stuff. So it's not really as a competitive market. A truly competitive or fiercely competitive market is one based on that of a free market. So it's not as simple as saying, well, this is the fault of, the price system to do with the laws of supply and demand that's the problem. There are other factors that play into things. For example, like that of the government subsidies that create many issues, and of course because of all the restrictions that government imposes on businesses, then businesses have obviously got to try and find a way around the government's regulation. And this is often actually the very reason why businesses end up just dumping stuff, because government's regulation has incentivized that. So it's actually government's regulation that's actually the cause of why businesses are doing that. If you were to remove the government's regulation and remove the government's interference in the private sector, and if you were to leave it be to regulate itself, they wouldn't be doing, those type of things. So when we talk about the argument on the whole thing to do with profits and losses driven by consumers' demand, the reason why that is efficient is because, after all, it's consumers who are freely walking into stores and picking and choosing what goods they want and what goods they don't want. I mean, if you were to eliminate that information, how then do you know the information of what consumers' needs and wants are? Well, that's the issue. You don't. I mean, you've got to remember, you're looking at a population in Great Britain, hell, even Scotland is like a population of 5 million people. I mean, even if you were to, try and work out the needs and wants of 5 million, never let alone 65 million people, you're going to be faced with an absolute nightmare, because of the fact that every single individual of society all have different needs and wants from one another. We don't all want the same things. And because of the fact that consumers' needs and wants dramatically change day from day, to week, change sporadically happens because people change their minds. New things come out all the time. Technology changes all the time. Nothing is ever fixed. So, and plus the fact, even if you were to plan for certain events, 6 months from now, you've no way of knowing who's going to show up, how many's going to show up, who to plan for, etc., etc. If you're centrally planning, that is. And the only reason why the market is efficient in determining stuff is because the profits and losses is information conveying that. So in other words, businesses can know how much to produce of said goods because they're seeing how many of such goods is selling relative to consumers' demand. It's consumers that are determining that. They're the ones determining to businesses, here's how much we're buying, here's what we're buying. Therefore, you as a producer, you know from this information what resources to use, where to allocate the resources, and where to stop allocating, etc. Because after all, businesses are not going to allocate resources into a part of the market where goods are not selling. And it's just as simply by consumers simply shopping around, determining what they want and don't want. That's effectively what profits and losses are. When you take away profits and losses, you're effectively taking away the information of what consumers' needs and wants are. And it's like I gave the example from Thomas Sowell in his book Basic Economics. Thomas Sowell was conveying about the example of, cheese, yogurt, ice cream, etc., etc. Well, how do you know where you're going to take the resource of milk into producing those goods? Well, you can't just, guess. You can't just take a certain amount of milk and just, well, here's how much we'll just, allocate this amount of milk into producing this, and this. But that isn't how the real world works, because, in certain times during the market, you've got time preference. So, consumers are not going to, want the same things at whatever given time. For whatever reason being, consumers might have a certain demand or a greater demand for one specific type of cheese over others. But if you remove price information signals, that information is gone. The only reason why you know at a specific given time that one type of cheese is greater in value or greater, in demand over that of others is because when consumer demand drives up, the price drives up. That's how producers know, by looking at price, where they're going to allocate milk at that specific given time. So they're not going to allocate it into something where, of course, they're not seeing the price change. Price isn't something fixed. That's the whole point of price fluctuation. The price fluctuation is information, signals to the market, conveying important information. And another thing to note is the fact that, let's just say a disaster was to come along, right? And for whatever reason being, and I've used this example before, let's just say a disaster came along, an earthquake or whatever it may be, and your oak wooden trees just happen to become devastated. They've just crashed underground. You've lost a lot of the oak wooden trees, etc., etc. What do you think happens when your oak resource goes into a severe scarcity? Well, the answer is, in the market, in your stores where you've got all the oak wooden products, the prices increase. Now, that's not a case of greed. That's because the laws of supply and demand is saying, here is where there's a shortage. There's a shortage of this oak resource. And what it does is it incentivizes consumers, don't overspend on this resource. Maybe you should look at alternatives until we can replenish the wood resource that's been destroyed. Because there's a scarcity. That's what the higher price in the market is signifying. It's a price signal to say, here is where there's a shortage, don't overspend on this. Or, if somebody is willing to pay a lot more for something like that, then fair enough. But they're basically saying, this price signal is basically saying to the market, here's where there's a shortage, maybe you should look at alternatives. So in other words, birchwood, etc., etc. That's the point. Because see, if you were to just take away prices and just simply remove the information of price signals, where you've no longer got, the higher and lower prices to convey to the market to say, here's where there's a shortage, here's where there's an abundance. Once you remove all of that information, how then do you know what's in shortage and what isn't? Well, you don't. Because that was the whole point of the price signal information. That was the whole point of the market price signals conveying that. Now, given the very fact that you've got an entire economy to deal with, where you've got millions of different products out there, and thousands of different industries. I mean, you're talking about those the clothing industry, such as those who are in the fashion industry, etc. All the clothing companies, or you know the video game industry, or I don't know, maybe it's something to do with photography, or you know, hundreds and hundreds of different industries out there in the market, right? You've got to know, from the price signal information, where you're going to allocate resources and where not to. And because demand is so sporadic, it's very difficult to determine otherwise. I'd like to obviously hear your own input on those things.
Yeah, of course. So generally speaking, I believe there's a couple of topics that we should probably reach in terms of the whole discussion. The first thing is in terms of supply and demand as a model of distribution. You had mentioned within, I believe, the beginning of your uh, discussion that you weren't aware of what perfect competition was. Is that correct?
No, it's not that I'm not aware of the, because it's based on this perfect equilibrium. It's the answer is there's no such thing. It's a myth. The idea of perfect competition is a myth. It's and it doesn't have any effect whatsoever. Just because there isn't perfect competition, it doesn't have any effect whatsoever on the efficiency of the market. I mean, the market's changing persistently. It changes constantly. That was kind of the point.
Yeah, of course. Generally speaking, as far as I've been able to understand, one of the main reasons as to why supply and demand works as a model is mainly because of not only perfect competition, but also no public goods within transactions and no externalities. Generally speaking, assuming that perfect competition is a myth, then that just kind of throws the whole supply and demand model out the window. Generally speaking, that's not exactly a good sign for it on its own. But along with this as well, I guess generally speaking, I remember you had asked for me to try and elaborate on the empirical evidence for markup pricing. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than happy, obviously, to hear anything.
Yeah, of course. Generally speaking, for example, within the United States, market pricing is roughly 70 to 85% of the total U.S. industrial prices. Within Canada, I believe that, sorry, I'm just trying, I have it in front of me so far. But basically 67 of firms within Canada, for example, also apply markup pricing. And generally speaking, these prices do change, of course, but it
Mm.
seems irrespective of demand. Generally speaking, the only way that market pricing could actually change, at least according to the empirical evidence, is if the total average unit costs change or if the business just wants more profit. And that's as far as I can understand. And along with this as well, you had also mentioned, generally speaking, that companies would work better without regulation. And I will say this right off the bat, there are certain cases where overregulation does happen and generally messes with small businesses. I'm not going to deny that. But generally speaking, I don't think that regulation is the same that we are all facing here. For example, there's been God knows how many issues within industries that have not been exactly regulated. For example, just in February, within America, it was found that baby food companies were actually selling uh, like unsafe uh, heavy metals that could cause really bad damage when it comes to infant brain development, and they gave no warning for this. And along with this as well, for-profit schools, assuming that they're not regulated as well, also find that students leave with really high debt. And along with this as well, they can barely find jobs either once they leave these schools.
So let me
I'm
cover.
just not exactly sure.
Yep. So let me just cover quickly on the issue here, um, because when you speak about this to do with, and I'm, it's important to note, I'm not painting something of perfection, and this is often what you'll find with people who have got a utopian mindset. No, I'm not having a go at yourself, but people with a utopian mindset have this idea of, almost as if perfection, like they speak of, absolutes, like 100%, as if to say they can get rid of, corruption 100%, exploitation 100%, as if to say in this utopian world they can get rid of, dangerous stuff 100%, etc., etc., etc. The problem with the argument there, when you're speaking about a dangerous industry that carries out, such dangerous practices, is that this is actually due to government's interference and the lack of competition in the market that's created this problem. Because if you were to go back before the OHSA, which was the Occupation for Health and Safety Administration, that was the government regulatory body. Now, for more than 100 years, I'm not saying that during the 20th century, for much of that period, that it was somehow, this period of strong free market capitalism. That just isn't the case. Of course, saw the intervention in various things. You could go on the whole thing to do with the Great Depression, etc., etc., etc. However, when the market was absent from the government regulatory body, it was due to capitalism, even present to some extent, that was what enabled the workplace to become safer. So in other words, the workplace injuries was continuously declining year in, year out. The workplace death toll was declining rapidly year in, year out for more than 100 years. Now, isn't it convenient that as soon as the government stepped in with the OHSA, the Occupation for Health and Safety Administration, in 1970, workplace injuries fell stagnant and has been stagnant ever since. Now, the very reason for why capitalism is efficient in that sense, why capitalism was reducing the workplace injuries and death toll and making the workplace actually a lot safer, is simply because you've got to think of competition and business reputation. Now, you speak about, you mentioned about that of businesses looking for profits. Sure. Profits isn't just merely something that you fill your own pockets with, though. As if to say, oh, profits is just something of seeking a surplus. That's not profits. Profits is information, again, telling the market, here's what consumers want, here's what you need to produce more of, here's where you need to allocate the resources, what resources you're going to use, how much of it you're going to use, and what to invest more in, how resources are transported, etc., etc. However, again, if a business wants to maximise their profits, they're going to have to minimise their costs. Because if you don't look after your costs and let's say something costs you a lot, you're losing out. You're going to be more profitable by cutting your costs. And the only way you can cut your costs is by being more efficient. Now, if a business was not to look after its reputation, if a business was to just say ignore its reputation and let's say it was to go down the road of having a reputation of being a dangerous industry, what do you think having a dangerous reputation is going to cause? Well, first and foremost, those who work for the company, and let's say one of them get injured and ends up leaving the company, they're going to spread bad word about the company. The company is going to have a reputation for being very dangerous. So, if the company or industry is very dangerous, how then does the company or industry entice future employees to come and work for them? Well, they would have no choice but to pay out a wage premium. That means they're going to have to pay out, danger money. Now, you see this as a prime example, and the evidence is found everywhere. You can see that even with people who work in the offshore oil industry. I think it's like the last time I checked, because I went through training and everything like that. Um, the last time I checked, you get about £30,000 alone just for somebody who's a steward. Never let alone people who do the sort of mixing of dangerous chemicals, where they get like £33,000 a year. Um, the point being is the fact that the more dangerous the job is, such as electricians, etc., they would probably get 60 to 70 odd thousand a year. So it's danger money. So the very reason why that exists is because of how dangerous it is. You have to entice people to come and work in dangerous jobs. So the example you just gave there, it's not going to be as profitable. The reason why it's not going to be as profitable is because it's dangerous. So what's a company and industry incentivized to do? To improve the safety of its workplace. That way they don't have to pay out the wage premium. So that's the first point, right? And as you mentioned there about the companies in, for example, in Canada, I'm sure it was, or something. Well, of course they're looking for profits. But it's not like people can say, well, they put profits above people. That's just because profits is the information of people. You understand what I'm saying? So that's kind of the point that I just wanted to address there.
Right. Yeah, that leads back into how effective his profits when it comes to being representative of demand. And like I said before, there doesn't seem to be really anything that can actually prove profits as a good way to measure demand. Although certainly, yes, people buy stuff. No one denies this. The issue is that we cannot measure demand in terms of subjectivity, or as more fancy economists may put it, marginal utility. These things are barely measurable. And so it seems like profits within themselves, although sure they may be representative of consumers liking something, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should allocate more to here or allocate more to here, because that can depend on a lot of things other than profit.
Well, the problem with that argument is when you say about how profits wouldn't be able to determine that, it actually does, because you've got a price on everything. You've got a price on goods. Of course, it's the consumers who determine what that price is. After all, in economic reality, you might like to believe that a business can set whatever price they like, but the reality is, if the good is not selling, the business is forced to reduce their price to whatever the consumer is willing to pay for. So it's actually the consumer that determines what price really is. But the fact that goods have prices on them, businesses can see on their system through their computers and stuff like that. They can see how much a good has been selling, how many times it's been selling, how many times the consumer has bought the product or whatever. They can see that information. It's calculated. And the reason why it's calculated is because consumers are the ones driving what's being produced and what isn't. Just simply by consumers shopping around freely. They are determining what the profits are. So businesses can simply calculate from the total amount they've sold of each specific good. Therefore, they know the information of how much to produce and where to allocate the resources. See, it's like I said earlier on, it's not so much to do with the fact that the calculation's the main issue. Sure, that is an issue that you're going to be faced with when you destroy the information of prices completely. However, the main issue is the fact that, and what socialists don't seem to comprehend, It's the fact that what profits and losses are, they're signals. It's information of consumers' needs and wants. That's the point. So in other words, let's just imagine for a second, you just completely eliminated the information of what profits and losses are, and you had no prices whatsoever. Well, how then do you know, out of, an entire market, an entire economy, how much to then produce, and what to produce, and where to allocate it in the market? Well, there's no information of profits and losses, is there? Profits and losses was information in the market saying, here's what's not selling, here's what is selling at whatever specific given time period. Now, Thomas Sowell gave a good example of the complexity, and he illustrates this with the central office in Texas for providing petrol. And let's say across the United States you've got, hundreds and hundreds of different petrol stations, dotted all over the entire length and breadth of the United States of America, right? And with regards to the profits and losses. Now, the reason why the market knows how much of each resource to use and where to allocate it to what petrol station is because prices convey that information. Now, let's suppose, because let's just imagine, here you have the cheaper petrol fuel used for the cheaper motors. You've got the more expensive lead petrol for the sake of fueling sports motors. And then you've got the, diesel for filling those with lorries and trucks and whatever, and taxis, I'm pretty sure, and probably buses. But the point being is that, let's just say that you get rid of prices completely, okay? And then you've got this central office in Texas that has to determine how much of lead, of the cheaper lead, the cheaper petrol, or the more expensive lead petrol or whatever, pretty sure, for the sports motors and, of course, diesel. Let's just say that central office was to determine how much it's going to allocate to each and every single petrol station, hundreds and hundreds of them dotted all over the entire length and breadth of the United States. How's it going to know that information? Now, to make it more complex, things are very, very sporadic. The best example I could give to this is kind of like when I went to photograph, red squirrels. Red squirrels have got a mind of their own. You don't know where they're going to run. You don't know what direction they're going to go. You don't know what they're going to do. You can't predict what they're going to do. It's no different to the nature of, society, right? And plus the fact new events pop up out of nowhere. For whatever reason being, an event could have popped up, created out of nowhere. Maybe it's a boxing match. Maybe it's something, a sporting event. Whatever it may be, right? Whatever the event may be, it might have just sprung up out of nowhere. Plus the fact events end up being cancelled, end up getting removed, or moved to another date, etc. Things change sporadically. So traffic is going to change sporadically. Therefore, people who travel long distances, for whatever reason being, they might, travel from Texas all the way up to, I don't know, New York or something like that. And these things happen sporadically. So petrol stations are going to have different demand each week, never let alone each month, right? So let's just say a petrol station in California is going to have a lot of sport motors showing up at the petrol station one week. Okay. So how then, without prices, does it know that information? It doesn't. The central office just doesn't know that information at all. It's not exactly going to, watch on camera like every single petrol station, like every single minute of the day, and watch like every single move that they're doing. It's impossible, right? So the only reason why, because so many sport motors show up at this petrol station in California, the only reason why they know where to allocate the more expensive lead petrol to that station is because the price drove up. The price information signal conveyed that information. And it's telling that during this time in the market, here's how much we need to allocate there, because it's based on price, it's based on how much is being bought. They can tell that information. Now, like I said, consumer demand isn't fixed. It's not like it's just going to be, well, this one specific petrol station is going to have that level of traffic for sport motors all year round. For whatever reason being, for all you know, the reason why it's had more sport motors turning up at that one petrol station at that time period, it might have been a sporting event that might have taken place. Or for whatever reason being, some group decided just to have some sort of not some official event, but just decided to go on some sort of journey or whatever it may be. It's kind of like those who show up at Strathclyde Park with showing off of the motors and all the rest of this nonsense. That's the point. You can't predict people, right? People are not simplistic. People are very complex, and that's just one petrol station. So it's not going to have the same demand all year round. It's not going to be sport motors showing up there. For all you know, next month or next week, it could be the normal motors showing up, or more and more of the diesel type motors, that taxis, buses, I'm guessing like the trucks, etc. They might show up. Now, that's the point. You talk about one petrol station that's like that. Never let alone each and every single other petrol station up and down the length and breadth of the entire, United States of America. You imagine what happens then when you just eliminate price, and soon as profits and losses is just completely gone, how then does that central office know how much it's going to allocate of the cheaper fuel, the lead, more expensive petrol for sports motors, and diesel? It doesn't know. All it's left with is guesswork. All it's left with is guessing how much it's going to allocate to each and every single petrol station. Because at the end of the day, that was the purpose of price signals. You see, again, let's just imagine for a second that petrol station sees the end of, the sport motors showing up at that, particular petrol station for whatever reason being. And then next month you start to see more diesel engines showing up at that particular petrol station. The only reason why the central office in Texas knows this is because the price drives up of in that particular area of diesel. That's it. It's consumers' increased demand. It's the laws of supply and demand. So it is actually down to profits and losses that allow you to allocate efficiently. Because, like I say, I mean, you get rid of that information, then how do you know how much you're going to allocate to each station? You don't. And given the fact that demand changes consistently, it would be a nightmare for a central planner to do. An absolute nightmare. So that's kind of the whole point.
Yeah. You touched on a couple of points. Yeah, again, I should probably clarify here. Although, yes, if you're too costly or if consumers don't buy you, sure, you get out of business. But that does not necessarily then entail that consumers then set prices. Like I said before, there's a bunch of empirical evidence that show that companies will mark up prices based on the average cost unit of production and then add a little bit on top for some profit. Generally speaking, the companies still set the price no matter what. Just because a consumer doesn't buy in, they go out of business, that doesn't then necessitate that a consumer then sets profit. And along with this as well, you had also mentioned a solution as to how to calculate the supply necessary based off of profits. Could you repeat that for me again, just so that way I can make sure?
Repeat that last bit again.
You had mentioned, I guess not necessarily a solution, but basically a process as to how to calculate the supply necessary from profits. Could you repeat that again?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so basically, prices, right? Prices are there on the goods, so a business can see, obviously, in its system how many of those goods are selling, so it can calculate. That's how it's able to tell, how much to produce. It's in the incentive of a business to do so. A business would not have the incentive to overproduce. Yes, this can happen through inefficiency, through subsidies, etc., like I've mentioned, but it's in the incentive of a business to maximise the profits. So that's the entire issue, because at the end of the day, it costs you more to use more resources. It's as simple as that. So businesses know from the goods that they are selling, they know how much they're selling off, and the price obviously on the good for each of that product it's selling. They can calculate that up. They know how much to produce based on consumer demand. And this is the other thing, and you did touch upon there, just to quickly address, it is the consumer that's determining what prices are. I mean, it's all well thinking businesses can just put down whatever price they like, but it isn't economic reality, because the bottom line is a business can only set a price to a certain amount. Now, it's down to whether the consumer is willing to pay for that or not. If consumers are not willing to pay for something, you've got no choice as a business owner but to reduce your price. No choice whatsoever. None. Now, you might look at the market and think to yourself, well, okay then, how come you've got certain companies selling goods at a very expensive price? The answer is because they're targeting a certain niche. Like, take for example, I can think of a typical company like Fraser's in Glasgow. Fraser's is a very, very expensive, clothing company, and they sell belts like £400 and stuff like that. Jesus Christ. It's like even their scarves are probably worth about £400 or something. Right? A very, very expensive company. But why is it able to target a certain, why is it able to set prices at that level? Because it's targeting a certain niche who's willing to pay for that. If that niche was not willing to pay that amount, the business has got no choice but to reduce its prices, because otherwise it's not going to sell. What worth would be producing goods, put it out there on the shelves, and if it's not going to sell, then what are you worth then? You're worth nothing. Your business is going to go under. So economic reality is you have to put a price at something people are willing to pay for. So yes, certain companies get away with selling goods at a more expensive price, but that's because they've got a consumer base there willing to pay for that. It's just like Apple. Whether you like it or not, their goods are very, very expensive, but there is a large number of people out there who are willing to part with their money and pay for it. See if that disappeared. See if the consumer's demand fell and people were not willing to part with their money. Apple would be left with no choice whatsoever but to reduce its prices. That's why it's down to the consumer that determines that. So yes, at the end of the day, they can calculate from prices, and based on how many goods that are selling, they can determine that, and therefore they know how much of a resource to use. Now, on a quick point to note in relation to that, capitalism rewards efficiency and it punishes inefficiency. That's the very reason why John Davis and Rockefeller wiped the floor with many of his competitors. Because Rockefeller was obsessed with efficiency, meanwhile his competitors were inefficient. They were just dumping 40 to about 60% of their crude oil. They were just dumping it. Meanwhile, Rockefeller found ways to, store such crude oil rather than wasting it. And because of saving, because of being more efficient, because of being obsessed with efficiency, Rockefeller was gaining from it. Meanwhile, those companies were going under. That's why in a capitalist system, capitalism rewards success and punishes failure. Those who are going to be inefficient in a capitalist system are going to be punished severely. So it is not in the incentive of companies just to be inefficient. And thinking that businesses can just set whatever prices they like, it's going to go down the road of inefficiency. Right? It will. Because the economic reality is, it's what you serve for the customers, what the customers want. Now, if businesses can get away with selling higher prices, like I said, that's all down to what the consumer determines and the specific niche that they target.
I'm not exactly. I think we're probably gonna get stuck on this topic because I find it hard to believe how because of the fact that because consumers may not buy certain goods, then that means that consumers are are the ones that determine the profits. Again, generally speaking, it's the businesses that actually set the prices. Sure, they may change their prices depending on the type of consumers they're trying to reach, but ultimately, it's not the consumer that's in the business or trying to decide what's an optimal price in order to get the other consumers. It's a businessman. And again, we can see that 70 to 85% within U.S. industrial prices, for example, are from markup prices. I just don't see as to how we can properly say that consumers are the ones that set the prices when ultimately the only thing that they are is just feedback.
Well, that's kind of the point, is because it's, it's like I said anyway. I mean, it's going back to the point. I mean, it's down to, you can say businesses can set the prices, but it really isn't. Yes, they can certainly determine what a price may be, but that's only going to be determined down to what consumers are willing to pay for something. That's where the prices really come from. So they're only going to put a price at something based on not just competition, but that of consumers. And when you say market prices is prices determined by the consumer. That's what prices are. That's what market-driven prices are. It's consumer-driven prices. So it's basically a consumer. But going on, I mean, and this goes on to the argument relative to this with the resource misallocation. When you go back to the argument on the whole thing to do with Thomas Sowell's example of the petrol stations, well, how then are you going to know without the information of prices? How then are you going to know how much petrol to use in each one of the locations? And you can see the evidence of the economic calculation problem. It was plastered all over the Soviet Union. You've seen it in the NHS. You've seen it in a variety of places. You saw it with the shortage at the pump in 1974, and of course in the United States. It was the misallocation of resource into wrong parts. When if things were left down to the market-driven prices, resources being allocated to the correct places and stuff like that. Forget the point that price ceilings resulting in the shortage problems, etc. for a second, but there's resource misallocation that occurs in each example through the price fixing. So in Thomas Sowell's example of the petrol stations, without the prices, how then are you going to, determine what petrol goes and where? What type of petrol and how much you're going to use, and where you're going to allocate it to what petrol station. That's the point.
Well, here's the thing. If we're using not only prices in order to determine allocation, but also the amount of goods that we're actually serving out to the consumers, wouldn't it be a little bit redundant to use prices within that allocation equation? Or is there something within prices that somehow managed to unlock everything?
Well, that's the issue, because it's like I explained. I mean, it's fairly simple to understand. Um, the reason why that petrol station I gave as an example before knows how much of lead petrol, more expensive lead petrol, the reason why it knows where to allocate it to that specific petrol station is because the price drove up due to consumers' increased demand of those type of sport motors showing up at that specific petrol station at that specific given time, because price information signals convey that. That's why you have price fluctuation. When the price drives up, that's signifying that the demand is greater than what's available. So therefore the central office knows to allocate that specific petrol and how much of it to that specific location. Now this is the point, because what you don't seem to understand is it's price information signals that's conveying that information. If you take away the information of prices, just remove prices, how then do you know? That's the entire issue.
No, I mean, you can also do reports. Like if I say that I'm digging out 50 gallons of oil or something, and then I'm serving out 25, then that seems to be at least some kind of way in order to determine allocation based on that front. Again, I don't see how prices, if we're pairing them up with the amount of goods that are actually being consumed by consumers, I'm not exactly sure how these are actually necessary in determining allocation.
Well, of course, I mean,
I mean, sure, it's price signals, but I mean, like price signals, of course, they're some kind of way of information. But even then, there's an issue with price signals as conveying information in itself. For example, even if you're to account for all the externalities that come with, for example, a car, because a car can cause climate change based off of the gasoline that it's pumping out. But the problem is that with the price of a car, that doesn't represent the social cause of the climate change that's caused by the car. And so even if the cost was represented within the total cost, that doesn't tell you where the costs are coming from. I mean, again, I just going back on what I was saying, I don't see how uh, prices would be necessary in order to determine resource allocation if we could just look at the actual amount of goods being sold.
yeah, I mean, it's this thing where
Yeah.
the whole argument there is problematic, because obviously when you're speaking about this to do with, some sort of reporting, well, people don't give honest answers in surveys for a start, and you're not going to have, things like surveys and reports like every single, minute of the day. It's I mean, this is the thing, because it's like I say, consumer demand isn't fixed. It continuously changes. It's sporadic. I mean, it's unpredictable. It's not fixed, and it's continual. People are right now using petrol stations across Great Britain. Right now, there's people at petrol stations. Now, I don't know what type of motors are going to show up at those petrol stations, but the only reason why a central office knows how much of the specific type of petrol to allocate to each petrol station is simply because they know from how much is being sold at each petrol station and what type of motors are showing up. That's how they understand that information from price signals. That's the point that you don't seem to comprehend. They are gathering that information from the calculated prices, and they're gathering that information because the price fluctuation is able to occur. When you eliminate that information, it's gone. Now, another fine example, and this moves on to the argument now on the scarcity, and this is relative to prices. And again, Thomas Sowell had gave that example. I gave the example of the beachfront housing, for example. Well, there's the issue. Because if you were to argue on housing as an example relative to scarcity, right? And let's just say, for example, just look at any country with housing. No two people want to live in the same place. For whatever reason being, people want to live in specific parts. Even within here in Glasgow, there are people who want to live in specific parts of the city. They might not want to live in a particular area for whatever reason being. Even then, they might not want to live in a specific type of house. Is all housing the same? Are people wanting to live in the same type of areas? No, of course not. For example, some people prefer living in the countryside. Other people prefer living, besides the beach or something like that. So beachfront property or whatever it may be. That's the thing, right? And what you've got is scarcity of land. Scarcity of land means there's only so much of it available, right? And since that demand is vast and different across each and every single part, housing isn't just something fixed and just one. So, let's say you've got a very high demand for a specific area. Let's just say, like Thomas Sowell's example with the beachfront property. If there's only that one specific area with a specific quantity of that land available, and there's only a specific quantity of that housing available, without prices, how are you going to determine who gets to live in them?
Yeah. I mean, so far this seems to fall back again on the effectiveness of the supply and demand model as a representation of prices. And again, I guess I'll just go back on this one more time. 70 to 85% U.S. industrial prices are because of markup pricing. And along with this as well, you also have to consider that even if prices were determined by supply and demand, you also have to consider the fact that supply and demand only really works under certain assumptions. And one of those assumptions is with externalities, that there's no externalities within the product being mentioned. But the issue is that once you include externalities, you then realize that the social cost of something should actually, or at least like the total price at least, something along those lines, should be pretty higher compared to what it actually is within the market. Thus, that then leads, because of the fact that the actual optimal price will be lower than the supposed optimal price, one that doesn't include externalities, that will lead people to buy more of it, which then leads to more supply, which then it's lesser prices. It's generally just a big blow up in terms of actual, I guess, like caring about the world, especially in terms of the environment, if we assume that prices are determined by supply and demand, which again, market pricing, if you'd like, I could just give you what I'm referencing here in terms of the empirical evidence for market pricing.
There's the issue because, again, I mean, I'm not. when you're speaking about prices, yes, they are determined by the consumers. There's no question of that fact. What you're speaking about is an influence from the outside that's forcing prices up and causing a problem, such as, for example, it could be government's taxation that's creating a problem, government's regulation over this whole nonsense on climate change that's creating a problem, that's forcing businesses to up their costs. They've got no choice but to do so. It forces many businesses out of business. And in fact, there's one fine example of that more recently, where someone was complaining on GB News that, because of the whole thing on the aim for zero carbon emissions or something, her business is being severely affected, and of course it could potentially put her out of business. Those things can affect a business to change their prices, and they have no choice but to do so. But that does not necessarily mean to say that that's going to benefit the business at all. Because the reality is, as much as you might like to believe that businesses can just put down whatever price they like, that is not reality. Because the reality is it going to sell? That's the reality. It's a bit like myself. I'm a photographer. Now, when I go to do my pet photography, where's the guarantee that I can set down whatever price I like? There is no guarantee. In fact, if that was based on anything of truth, then I could set my price at £5,000. But who's going to pay for it? Nobody. Because they can easily turn to someone more experienced. Now, I'm obviously a photography graduate. I obviously know what I'm doing with a camera. I can take good pictures. But that means nothing in the reality of things, because you have to look at your competition, what they're setting their prices at. You have to look at, a variety of other factors. You have to look at your own experience. That's the very reason why when I go in to do my pet photography, I will have... part of me will offer a service to do specific jobs completely free, just so I can gain a bit of experience first and foremost, and secondly, to build a portfolio to show on my website, here's the pet photography that I can do, right? That's the point, right? Now, if I don't have experience, if I don't have a portfolio, if I don't have anything there, can I just set a price and say £5,000 and people will just pay for it? No, they won't. What's that going to force me as a business person to do? It's going to force me to reduce my costs, to reduce my prices. Because the economic reality is what consumers are willing to pay for things. That's that specifically. You kind of swerve past the argument on scarcity there, and went on the road of something to do with climate change and stuff like that. And in relation to what I says, when it comes to the whole thing on, prices, yes, it can be affected by government, imposing higher taxes or imposing certain regulations like the minimum wage control. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that that is going to benefit businesses. It isn't. In fact, it's actually what leads to many of the businesses end up going under. And it happens time and time again. It's not like businesses can just afford these type of things. It just isn't the case. It isn't the reality. So that's kind of that point. Because, and again, this whole thing on, and I've seen this argument numerous times, this negative externalities argument is just nonsense. Let's just use a scenario for example. Let's just imagine, hypothetically speaking, in a capitalist system and all land was privately owned. And then let's say, for whatever reason being that, I've got a river that runs through into someone else's property. Would I have I wouldn't even call it the luxury, because it isn't a luxury. Would I have the freedom to just dump waste into the river? Well, it's going to end up contaminating the river further downstream in the other person's property. What's going to happen as a result of that? Well, you've got secure private property rights. That other person can take me to court for that. Therefore, because of secure private property rights, they're not going to get away with that negative externality. It's just like someone that runs a factory and is contaminating my land. I could take that person to court because of the fact that you've got the reality of your secure private property rights, especially if they're contaminating your property. So it's self-regulating in that sense. The other thing that you don't touch upon is the reality that your land can either appreciate in value or depreciate in value. Now, you acknowledge the fact that businesses have an incentive to make a profit. Just like private landowners, they have the incentive to make a profit. That is the goal of any private business owner or private landowners, to make a profit. Of course, a private landowner would want to sell their land off at a profit, or pass their land off onto their, their young ones, or whatever may be, profitably, leaving it profitably in their hands. Now, it's just like the example of contaminating the river. Where is your incentive to do that? If that's going to depreciate the value of your land, where's the incentive for you to do that? There is no incentive. You're depreciating the value of your own land. You're going to be running at a loss. There's no incentive. Your incentive is to look after your property, because you're faced with risk, right? Everything that you work for, you could potentially be facing a loss by doing that. That's the difference between private property and public property. Private property, you're faced with risks. Risk that you're going to face a loss. Public property, such as you look at, for example, all over Britain, contrast private housing to public housing. What's the difference? In all these public council housing areas, it looks like a dump. It looks like, a world war has taken place. Contrast that to the private property. Why is there a difference? The difference is, those who live in the public housing are being subsidised. Those who live in the property don't have an incentive to look after it, because they're not the one facing the brunt of whatever they do, right? There's no risk involved. Whatever they do, it's other people who pay for it. It's the taxpayers of the private sector across Britain who pay for it. So that they've not really got an incentive to look after their garden, to look after their property in the same way. That's why public housing ends up looking like a dump, and you end up seeing litter lying everywhere. Now contrast that to someone, or in most cases, where you get private property, where they are faced with risk involved. That is to say that there's the profit loss motive. Well, if someone was to take on their own private property, such as own their own private house or whatever, and they were to start, mistreating it, they're going to pay the financial brunt of that. They will pay the heavy price for that themselves. That's the point. You ignore the fact that property can appreciate and depreciate in value, so it's not as simple as saying, oh well, capitalism is faced with externalities. And you go on about the whole thing to do with climate change. Well, climate change is really just something, and I'm sorry to say this, but it is unproven. They keep saying it's proven. It really is not proven. If it was proven, why on earth was it the fact? And you get this from the likes of, what was her face? Extinction Rebellion. By Christ, right? You get this from the likes of Extinction Rebellion, where they pretend it's been proven, right? Now, the entire word extinction is in their name. Drops the hint. Okay. So let's go along with their argument for a second. If that was the case, how come more than 500,000 years ago you saw, CO2 levels more than twice as high as it is today, yet there was no extinction? Now I could go on a whole tangent on its own, on the whole thing to do with climate change, but, and when people use that as an excuse to say, well, government has to impose these regulations and therefore businesses have to react, well, that's not exactly a logical argument, and here's the reason why. If you were to go down the road of saying that businesses have to are forced to react to the way government imposes these regulations, and they have to abide by what government regulation does, etc., etc., therefore it has to raise its prices, and if they can't afford to run business, then tough luck. If we were to go down the road of that argument, you're basically going to destroy the economy. Most importantly, and I always ask this question towards those who support the idea of climate change. The question you always ask these climate alarmists. One simple question. How is socialism, with its record of failure on the environment, going to solve your problem with regards to the climate change when you destroy the information of profits and losses? How then, being faced with the economic calculation problem, how is socialism going to be able to solve the problem of climate change? Because here's the issue. In every single socialist regime, you have seen the economic calculation problem. I mean, I gave the fine example, and I could quote it again, right? I'll just quickly dig it up because it's even within the first section of what Nikolai Shmelev and Vladimir Popov had touched upon and addressed upon themselves. And remember, these were Soviet Union economists, right? These were Soviet Union economists. I mean, these were people who, experienced firsthand of what it was like, right? The first one, state purchases increased and now all the distribution centres are filled with these pelts. Industry is unable to use them all and they often are left to rot in warehouses, right? That's the first one. So you had rotten, moleskin pelts in warehouses overproducing, and they said this is important, this quote. It says, no matter how much we wish to organise everything rationally, without waste, no matter how passionately we wish to lay all the bricks of the economic structure tightly, with no chinks in the mortar, it is not yet within our power. Now, that was caused because of the price fixing, right? That's why that problem occurred. Most importantly, the other quote was in relation to do with the cement and copper, where they go on to say, to make 1 tonne of copper we use about 1,000 kilowatt hours of electrical energy as against 300 in West Germany. To produce 1 tonne of cement we use twice the amount of energy that Japan does. So in other words, they're using more energy, right? Simply because they don't know how much to use. They don't know basically the information of profits and losses. So this is the issue, because the argument went down the road of computer technology. How's computer technology going to solve that issue? Well, the computer technology is not going to solve the issue, because the only way that you can rationally calculate is through profits and losses. If that information's gone, how do you then know how much to produce, or what to stop producing? I mean, each and every single individual of society all have different needs and wants, don't they? Every consumer all has different needs and wants. So, out of millions and millions and millions of different products out there on the market, it doesn't matter whether it's on energy or anything. How do you know how much of a resource to use and where you're going to allocate it? I mean, cement isn't just going to be used for, one specific area. It might have a variety of different uses. So with a variety of different uses, I mean, how do you know how much to use and where to use it? Well, that's the issue. Without prices, you don't hold that information.
Yeah, okay. I'll admit this is actually a bit of interesting topics I didn't expect to hit. So, in terms of negative externalities, first you touched on the fact that, simply speaking, we wouldn't be able to do negative externalities, or at least to the extent that we do now, because of the fact that if any company does actual harm within within the market, then generally speaking, you can either simply not buy from them or sue them. But the issue is that that then doesn't really account for example, what about Lineback versus McDonald's restaurants? This woman managed to get coffee so hot that it burned her legs and that she had to get 2 years of medical treatment and skin grafting. But the problem is that the jury damage included 160,000 and then 2.7 million in punitive damages. And this has also happened multiple times before Liebeck came around. Coffee was burning people's skin from this McDonald's. But the problem is that then by this point, everyone then paints it as a frivolous lawsuit. But the problem is that this was an actual thing that happened. This woman actually got burnt from coffee that was 190 degrees or 88 degrees Celsius, if you don't mind. It, you can't really promise that lawsuits will solve everything. Not only because of the fact that you can simply just kind of make up little hunks about it, but also the fact that you have to consider that the costs also get put on the consumer as well. How can you promise that there will be consumers who not only have enough money to sue in the first place, but also to get lawyers? That it just simply falls on its face when you recognize how lawsuits actually work. And then also, you had also mentioned that climate change wasn't really a problem, which I didn't expect to hit. But you had mentioned that 500,000 years ago, it was CO2 levels higher than what we have now. And apparently humans then didn't really go extinct. But that's great and all, but you also have to consider that the modern form of, humans have only existed for about 200,000 years. Civilization has existed for about 6,000 years. And then industrialization only started 200 years ago or so. The problem is not that simply we have high levels of CO2. Of course, that's not necessarily the issue. We've had high levels of CO2 in the past, but the problem is that we have high levels of CO2 and we're getting really higher really fast. And we have to account for this, especially considering the fact that now we're using a lot of fossil fuels. There's cars that rely on fossil fuels. It's a bit of a mess. And let's not forget as well, like for example, what was it? Deep water. I can't remember the exact name of it, but that basically speaking, what about when oil within the oceans perhaps starts to kind of just fire up? Recently, I think there was something within Mexico where oil pipeline that was within the water managed to explode and it caused a fire.
I've
I don't see how we can.
just quickly on that. Just quickly on that one. That was actually a state-owned oil company that caused that problem. And the funny thing was,
Yeah, I know. I saw that on Twitter. Yeah, that doesn't necessarily negate my point, though. The point is that these happen, and we have to account for climate change, no matter if it's state-owned or if it's privately owned. And we have to account for this when talking about capitalism and our distribution of resources. And that's that's the whole gist in terms of externalities. You had also mentioned that the USSR experienced the economic calculation problem. I'm going to be highly frank with you. I am having a bit of a hard time, especially with the quotes that you provided about how the quotes were examples of USSR experiencing the economic calculation problem. First off, two economists, for me at least, is not necessarily enough. You have to actually give maybe multiple economists that worked within the USSR or multiple studies that looked at the USSR in order to prove that the USSR did experience the economic calculation problem. But even then, if we do count that there was neglect of user need, which there was, Ian Jeffries even noted that it wasn't necessarily because there wasn't price signals, because let's be real, especially under Stalin, there were price signals. The problem was that the system prioritized quantity over quality. So I don't see how. I mean, and I should clarify as well. Ian Jeffries, I believe, is a professor in terms of East European economics. If there's anyone I would trust when knowing the economics of the USSR more, it would have to be at least Ian Jeffries. So I don't really see how the course that you provided would have been an example of the USSR. And you've also said that that the reason why the USSR experienced the economic calculation problem was because of price fixing, but you didn't really demonstrate that with like anything. You just kind of like stated that, which is a little bit ridiculous on my end, but that's another story.
Well, this is the issue because the Soviet Union was price fixing. When it came to the Soviet Union, it never had the price information signals because of the price fixing. That was the point. It was essentially planning prices. It was setting down price floors and price ceilings. That's why it was, it led to the shortage problems. And this was well known, right? It was faced with all the surplus waste problems. You even saw the shortage of goods even within the supermarkets and stuff like that. Just like in everyday events and stuff. This is not even talking about kind of like what you see of lockdowns and stuff. So the Soviet Union was absolutely rife with that. You mentioned obviously on the climate change. Now I'm not going to go on about the climate change argument. That's why I cut it short. But in terms of 500,000 years ago, I'm not saying that mankind was around 500,000 years ago. What I was saying was, life in the oceans, the oyster population, all the sort of, those creatures that would harden their shells. They hardened their shells to adapt to the temperatures, etc. Now, Extinction Rebellion's name drops the hint. Their argument was ocean acidification, right? Due to high CO2 levels. They said, if the CO2 levels get out of control, it's going to wipe out Earth and lead to extinction. Well, that's rather quite funny because the CO2 levels were twice as high back then, yet there was no extinction. All the sea creatures did was they adapted to the changes of the environment over thousands of years. That's all that happened. There was no extinction. Now, as geologists agree, it is basically the temperature that drives CO2, right? Not the other way around. So it is basically one of these arguments. Again, I'm not going to go into the whole, in depth about the whole thing on the climate change. However, it goes back to that question again. How is socialism going to solve the problem of the climate? And the funny thing is because if it was down to the free market, if we were living in a free market economy, if we get rid of this mixed economy, capitalism would push us towards nuclear power, right? And find alternatives. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't look after the environment. Of course we should. But it's a question of what system best does that. What's the most efficient system that enables us to do that? And in relation to the economic calculation problem, I'm sorry to say, but in every single socialist regime, whether you talk about the Soviet Union or all that, those two Soviet Union economists weren't like the only people who acknowledged that there was serious problems. That was the very reason why Boris Yeltsin, when he showed up at the United States of America, he was gobsmacked, depressed when he saw the supermarkets in the United States because they'd never seen anything like it in their life. And the reason why they were depressed is because, the West had given them a showing up. Now, the economic calculation problem is undeniable when it comes to places like the Soviet Union. And it's like I've mentioned. I mean, if you're going on about climate change, how is socialism going to solve this issue? Because, and this is the issue, because the opposite of private ownership, and it goes back to the definition on socialism, which isn't decentralisation, by the way. If you're moving away from private individual ownership, you're bringing it into collective ownership. So it means collectivise to centralise. That's why political centralisation is a big part of what defines socialism. So when you're speaking about socialism, to socialise, when you socialise agriculture, or you socialise medicine, in other words healthcare, or you socialise education, or you socialise any sort of property, you're bringing it together in a collective. Now, it's all well speaking about theory, but in practice, who's the one who taxes to pay? Because this is another question. And I don't know how you're going to get around this one, but what would you then insinuate? Are you insinuating that people that we should have a moneyless based economy? Answer this question first. Do you support a moneyless based economy, or do you support paying people wages? That's the first thing.
I support a moneyless economy.
Right. So obviously with that of a moneyless based economy, there's obviously going to be no prices, etc, etc. So the question I then ask, down the road of this argument, how then do you get people to do dangerous jobs? Because you've got electricians, you've got people who work in specific industries that require them working from dangerous levels of height, etc. What do you propose for those sort of people working in those industries if you're not going to pay them any wage at all?
Well, generally speaking, I would use remuneration according to effort and sacrifice, which is basically you give more remuneration according to people that are putting in more effort into their work and are sacrificing more of themselves in their work compared to other jobs. So, for example, if we're to have a coal miner, generally speaking, I think we can agree that's a dangerous job. But at the same time, we can also look at accounting and say, well, that's not necessarily anything major. You just have to do some quick math within your head. So, generally speaking, the main idea would be that you give the job of a coal miner more remuneration rather than the count.
When you mean remuneration, you're saying?
Remuneration, yes.
So explain to me what exactly that would mean.
Oh, remuneration is just a general term for what you get in return for doing work. Of course, this can take the form of wages within capitalism, but there's about a million and one different ways that you can use remuneration. For example, according to need is an example of remuneration according to need. There's remuneration according to output, but that's generally what remuneration is. It's just generally what you get for doing something.
Okay, so for me, the problem that I have with that argument is that for me it's a lot more rational under a price system, under a system where people are paid wages. And the very reason being is because why should it be down to other people to so-called reward that individual for work that they do and give them, why shouldn't it be down to the choice of the individual themselves to just be able to have a wage and then freely shop around for what they want, rather than being given whatever it is or whatnot? And again, if giving this is the issue, because there's no price system, there's nothing there to basically convey scarcity. There's nothing there really that tells information over quantity where to allocate production resources, etc. It's for me, it's very much chaotic because, and that's the entire issue. So we kind of get the idea that you support the moneyless based economy. Okay, so the question is, how is socialism going to be able to solve the problem? Because we have seen the economic calculation problem rife everywhere, and it's like I said. I mean, Kantorovich never critiqued the argument. He just offered a so-called solution that really doesn't solve anything. But the issue being is that how are you going to stop all the waste, all the shortages, the misallocation of resources, etc. within all of that? And it's like I said, I mean, no one denies the fact that it's, important to look after the environment. I do believe that myself. But it doesn't really make much sense to me. Because here's the issue with regards to socialism. They want to force the market in a direction, right? And that requires control. And for me, control is the antithesis of liberty. And that's always been the case. So, and this is the thing, because, and this this also leads on to the issue of the real world versus the theoretical world. Now, in the real world, the central planner is the one going to be controlling and dictating resources and production and planning production for an entire nation, right? That's just the real world. Plus the fact, if you want to try and get rid of the private sector, how do you do that without a dictator, right? I mean, that's an important question, because in relation to the economic calculation problem, even if you weren't to argue with the central government, but it's just that it's a problem where in practice, in reality, you're going to end up with exactly what you saw of the Soviet Union, with a central planner controlling resources, controlling how much gets produced and what gets produced. How does the central planner know the information of consumers' needs and wants? Because, like I said, in reality, who is it that carries out the nationalisation, gets rid of the private sector? Well, it's the central government, isn't it? You could obviously go off topic and start arguing, how does the central government just wither away for this anarchist utopia to usher in through the communist theory? All of these questions kind of go off topic, but you understand the point. So the issue being, in practice, when it goes down to that of the central planner, how's the central planner without the information of prices? Because you support a moneyless based economy. How does it know, quantity of production and who wants what? Because it's like I said, each and every single individual of society all have different needs and wants. So how do you work that out?
Well, here's the catch. I don't advocate for central planning. I advocate for participatory economics, which is a decentrally planned system. Generally speaking, what I use in terms of planning is that you have consumers fill out basically glorified shopping lists to basically represent demand. You then have workers, which fill out, what they want to produce and what they need to produce it. And this generally, all of this gets aggregated into federations necessary for each of the councils, consumer and worker councils. And then this gets put into an iteration facilitation board, which does not make any real decisions on its own, aside from maybe making 4 or 5 final plans, which everyone then decides on. And then, generally speaking, the iteration facilitation board then calculates supply and demand based off of the consumer and worker reports, and then after a few rounds, which is maybe 6 or 7 on average, you basically get 5 final plans with only minor alterations. Everyone then basically decides what plan they actually want to use, and then everything goes on just fine. Generally speaking, that's what I support for. And also, I should probably also mention, again, as far as I know of the issues within the USSR, I don't really think there's much of an economic calculation problem. I think, again, it's just mainly quantity over quality. We could probably explain the shortages, for example, by a tendency to understate productive capacity, which Ian Jeffrey also notes. Um, I mean, again, I'd hate to break it to you, but as much as I do not enjoy the USSR, I don't see how it's an example of the economic calculation problem.
Well, I mean, I think I've covered quite a fair bit, and obviously, on the entire thing. And I don't want to go on too long or that. And I see it's obviously just going on 2 hours, bearing in mind I'll cut out the stuff at the start. But the whole thing of what you're arguing, I mean, there's so many. It's just like what Christian Yemyets had pointed out in his book, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. It sounds a lot of aspirations that you have, but there's no clear information there. For example, there's no clear information there as to how the reports are going to tell you how much certain individuals want of whatever it may be. And the thing is the fact that, like I said, even in Kevin D. Williamson's example of the milk production, some families consume more than others, and certain individuals certainly consume more of a product than others. That's just the reality. And if you're faced with the reality of scarcity and you've got no price information signals, there's no price signal information there to tell you whether a good is in shortage or not at a specific given time. For me, it sounds rather chaotic in terms of that argument. However, I think it does give at least an insight into, viewers, obviously, they can obviously see your side of the argument. They've heard, obviously, from your perspective, and obviously they can make their own mind up on that specifically. But obviously, since it's gone on, the near enough 2 hours of that, I think I've pretty much covered whatever it is. It's been an interesting discussion on the whole thing to do with the economic calculation problem. Obviously, there's things that we're just not going to agree on, of course. That's just how things are. It's been obviously interesting having yourself on. But like I say, I mean, for me personally, when you look out there in society today, you go throughout, people in general, people want to be paid a wage, especially people who work in dangerous industries. They don't want to work for nothing, and I don't, for me personally, I don't think it's a rational idea of, such and such getting such and such. It's rational for them to be able to afford to get by in life, in my eyes, and be able to just freely shop around for whatever they want. And again, I don't need to go off on a whole tangent on the whole resource allocation, why profits and losses are so important, etc. I gave the example on the petrol stations as an example of that. It's, and that's just, from my perspective. So, is there anything you would like to, add in as a final note or that, anything like that, such?
I think in the grand scheme of things, I think we've pretty much capped off everything that we could probably discuss on. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I agree. It's obviously been good discussing with yourself on the things. I've never got a problem with that as such. Obviously, we just agree to disagree on those specific things. Um, who knows? I mean, if you read further into, the arguments on, what Mises was arguing and things like that, I felt that Hakim personally took, Ludwig von Mises way out of context in many things, but that's just how things are. It's like I said about the whole thing on Kantorovich, etc. It's all well thinking that computer software for an entire economy can somehow just work out people's needs and wants, but it just isn't as simple as that. Especially how quick changing is. But yeah, we've covered pretty much the basis of the economic calculation problem. As I say, people can make their own mind up in that.